My guest today had more fun during his career than a basket of warm artvarks in the springtime. His career got kickstarted by Frank Zappa, and after a stint with his mentor, he released a lot of adventurous music, both as a solo artist and as a sideman. Devin Townsend calls him a wizard and a super genius who uses his powers for good. Besides playing both piano, keyboard, and guitar like a monster, and being a great singer and songwriter, he loves apple pie. And don't dare to sell your car to any clown because you might piss him off. Welcome to this episode, Mike Keneally.
Thank you.
Well, how are you doing, Mike?
I'm good. I haven't had apple pie in a long time now, and that's all I can think about.
Yeah, it makes you happy.
It does.
That reminds me of that song. Hey, I'd like to begin at a very recent moment, and then we might end up on the day you were born. Let's see.
All right.
I saw the Moth by Devin Townsend yesterday with the orchestra, and afterwards you and Devin hugged, and there seemed to be so much in that hug after the show. Like, can you bring me there and tell me what you felt?
It was validating because I would say over the last year-ish, I mean, Devin's been dealing with the idea of the Moth and processing it and allowing it to gestate for a decade. But I really kind of only got on the train about a year ago, along with Sarah Crochet, my wife, and we started traveling to Devin's place and helping him deal with all of the. Initially, with just all the music that he'd written, because he'd had hours of stuff that he'd composed, all of which was fantastic, but it was a lot more than was required for the project because he'd been given essentially because of the need to use the orchestra, to use a choir, and to eventually put it on an album. The idea of trying to keep it limited to around 70 minutes of music. So the first project was to just kind of go through all this stuff that he had written and find the Moth within it. And then once that was done, put it into some kind of a running order that made sense. And then at that point, Sarah and Devin started seriously discussing the storyline and the characters, and she was dealing more with what he wanted to do with the story, and I was dealing more with what he wanted to do with the music, and so we were at the beginning of that process, and periodically we would go up to his place and kick the ball down the field a little bit further, and all along the way it felt a little unreal because it was so huge. The scale of the project is massive. So from it being just conceptual and vaguely unrealistic about a year ago to last night, it felt like it went by in a flash, but at the same time, so much had transpired.
Yeah.
So I think in that moment last night, there was a shared realization that this was all a little bit unreal, but also the fact that the audience's response was so warm and generous and a bit overwhelming. And that's what I was feeling at that moment. It's like all of a sudden this actually happened. We did it, and that was huge. And then also just I think we really I think we see a little bit of ourselves in each other.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a shared understanding there, and
in what way can you elaborate?
I don't know. It's kind of funny because we both, obviously we occupy different echelons in the industry, but we're both, I think, a bit similar in what we want to accomplish, and also just this desire to be productive. I've somewhat. I haven't been as productive over in terms of albums released over the last few years, but for a long time I was just pumping them out constantly, and obviously Devin's done that. So there's this, I think, a feeling like we both feel like, okay, we're here on this planet, we have this ability to do this thing. Let's get down to business, and then we also have shared sensibilities in terms of the idea that music doesn't have to be a conventional process, and the final result can be very idiosyncratic and very personal. And sometimes the thing that's the most important in a piece of music is the strangest little moment within it, some strange texture, some strange feeling that elicits, things that are hard to put into words, but that can somehow you can capture that feeling in a sound. And I think that fascinates both of us. So I think we understand each other, and you know, I'm just about exactly 10 years older than he is.
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder if he sees something of you know, what the future can hold. I don't know. And then I see, I remember that when I look at him, because I can remember back to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And again, he's dealing with issues on a larger scale, just because there's more of an audience. And obviously with a project like last night's, there's more of a budget, and that means increased pressures.
Wow.
You know, my career has been kind of on the down low as a solo artist. So in some ways I can get away with more.
but you both, it seems to be artists that have walked your own path, right? Both you and Devin.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting. Because we both went through the Steve Vai thing, and it's kind of funny because both Steve and I went through the Zappa thing. So Steve and I had that in common when I was in Steve's band, and we could relate to each other from that perspective. Oh, yeah. And then now Devin and I have both been through the Vai experience, and we can deal with each other from that perspective. And you know, we love Steve very, very much, and we share that, and it's you know, there's a number of things we have in common, and in the 90s, before I even ever met Devin, I was aware of him because of him being on Steve's record, and then he went and did this legendary clinic at Musicians Institute, where he just like took the piss out of the whole concept of doing a clinic, and I was. You know, in the 90s, I was really into sort of anti-entertainment and being provocative, and just sort of tweaking the idea of what you know a live music presentation should be. Yeah. And Devin was sort of like a shining beacon in that. So I did an album called Half Alive in Hollywood, and it was in the same venue where he had done this clinic. So at the end of the show, I said, I introduced the guys in the band, and then I said, I'm Devin Townsend. And that was you know, obviously I was just joking, but what I think I was doing was just aligning myself with his approach. You know, this idea that, you don't always have to, give in to the expected way of doing things. And so, you know, years went by, and then when I was in Joe Satriani's band, Joe and I were sitting up on the bus one night and talking. Somehow the topic turned to Devin, and we were just both talking. I was impressed by how impressed Satriani was with Devin. You know, he's like, Devin is obviously a genius. He's an amazing creator and inspiring. So when I got back to the hotel that night, I wrote Devin on Twitter, of all things. I sent him a private message and said, hey, Satriani, we're just sitting up on the bus talking about how great you are. And we had never spoken. Oh. So I just reached out of nowhere. And Devin's response to that was, hey, great. Do you need a bass player? I'm like,
sounds like him.
What? He goes, yeah, I'm really interested in playing bass right now. So if you have anything, you know, going on, let me know. So I said, okay. What I got from that was he's not aloof. He doesn't hold himself, you know, separate. He's just interested in music and experiences and adventures.
But he's also, I talked with him way back, and he shares about this, but he's a very sensitive person also. Are you in that? Do you relate to that as well? Like how the world comes in? Yeah.
And I think, I'm a sensitive person as well, but, and I came from, because I came from the Zappa thing, which is a lot of that, ethos was rooted in cynicism. And I was so young when I got in Frank's band, and thus impressionable. I took that on, and throughout the 90s and stuff, I think I had a kind of a cynical veneer that wasn't really who I was, probably.
Okay.
And so the 21st century has, I think, seen a gradual process of that melting away. Now, now I'm old, and the state of the world is so horrible. It's a real struggle to keep that cynicism at bay and to try to maintain that hopeful streak. And I would rather be oversensitive than not sensitive at all. So I see that in Devin, and I recognize aspects of that in myself, but you still have to find a way to function every day.
But is that becoming a bit cynical? Because in the bio on your own website, you say the experience with Frank Zappa, I still feel the repercussions of that. That was written a long time ago, but was that one of the things you meant with that? Like, because you obviously it's a big school, right? Playing with him, but it must have been tough also, right?
Well, it was tough from the perspective of I was so young, and it was a bit unsettling for that to be my first professional gig, which it was. I idolized Frank growing up, and so because I was naive and didn't have much world experience, much less musical, professional music experience. You can kind of form a fantasy idea of what it would be like to be in Frank Zappa's band. And then, I was fortunate enough to pass the audition, and there I was. And I was as green as I could possibly be. I was a puppy was the was the phrase used within that organization. The new guy, and I just felt like this is the most wonderful, exalted, amazing position to be in. But then that band, which was a large band, 12-piece band, that underwent a lot of difficulty and ultimately wasn't able to stay together because of that difficulty. That all seemed unthinkable to me, because in my young, super idealistic viewpoint, I was thinking, this is great. We're in Frank Zappa's band. We're traveling around the world. People love the shows. People love Frank. People love this music. I love this music. I'm making a living playing the music that I love and working for the guy that I grew up idolizing. What could be better? Yeah. But, all of a sudden, this is like the splash of cold water in the face. No, this is how the world works, is that, you still are privy to human feelings and resentments and anger and all these different that will affect your life. And
is that because you say I was green, and you were basically the only one who didn't get really fired back then, right? If I'm not incorrect.
It was at the end of the tour, Frank, took me into his dressing room and said, "Okay, this is the band I want to form next." And it was going to be him and me and Scott Tunis and Ray White and Mats and Morgan, Mats Oberg and Morgan Ogman, because we had just met Mats and Morgan in Stockholm, and they were both very young, and they came up on stage and played with us, and Frank was extremely enamored with their musicianship and their energy, which was youthful and nothing but music. It was just all about music. And I think Frank was eager to get back to that. So, I've gone off track.
I asked, I thought you were the only one that didn't really get fired from the band, because he also mentioned, you're Mike, he's not a prima donna. And obviously stating at the same moment, the rest of them were prima donna.
Well, I think that I don't want to go too deep into that, but I think it was Frank really loved Scott's playing. He enjoyed and appreciated Scott's energy as a person, and didn't want to jettison that. He wanted to continue working with Scott. I wanted to continue working with Scott. So what Frank wanted to do was just form a smaller band around that nucleus. But Frank was more ill than he realized at the time. And I think just the financial burden of that last tour and the physical burden of what was happening inside of him just wore him down, and that was it for him playing live.
When I was preparing for this interview, I got this image of Frank Zappa like being a big log in a tree, and all these branches grow from it, and some of these branches get connected afterwards in another way, like you and Devin and Steve, like, and there's so many branches that grew from that and
exactly
got intertwined and like, if I sketch that image, do you relate to that? You think, yeah, he was such a, yeah.
Oh, unquestionably. And I guess more, that you could, Pete Frame made a living from doing the family tree, but then you could do that with any number of musical artists going back through the decades. But I think more in the case of somebody like Frank, or say Miles Davis,
yes.
or anybody who was, obviously an innovator, somebody who was happy to practically create a new musical style with every album. And part of that included bringing new players into the mix because of wanting to hear different things. And also just the nature of the business. And when you're playing music that's that demanding, that personnel turnover, I think is going to be inevitable. And with Frank's music, the requirements to play his stuff were so specific and so stringent that he needed to find high quality players. And so you end up with like, as you say, just a lot of branches, and a lot of those players were creators in their own right, So you get Steve with his amazing career, you get George Duke with his amazing career,
incredible, right?
You get ridiculous drummers like Vinny and Terry and Chad, who they're so undeniably fantastic. And of course, they're going to play with a lot of people, and then everybody forms trees of their own.
yeah, exactly. But it seems like you went to the Olympics straight away, to the 100 meters finale, and then all of a sudden there's no Olympics anymore. Or how did that feel afterwards? Because you said, okay, that I idolized Frank, and you got the gig, but then afterwards, what you thought? Now what? Or
yeah,
how
that's
did it
exactly
feel?
what I felt. Yeah, and so I felt bereft, I guess is the best way to put it, and also a bit strung along, maybe a little bit of abandonment issues, because I had, in my youth and in my naivete and inexperience in the ways of the world and the music business, when Frank said at the end of the tour, I am going to form a 6-piece band and you are in it, and I knew that he had canceled, I think, 10 weeks of further touring in North America with the 12-piece band that we had in 1988. Once it became clear that he wasn't going to keep that band together anymore. So what I thought was, okay, we're gonna fulfill those dates. We're gonna go out and do a bunch of touring with this new 6-piece band. So I just went home and I was kind of waiting by the phone, and no phone call came. So months went by and I wasn't doing anything but waiting. And then I didn't realize yet that I needed to kind of take the bull by the horns and make something else happen. And so there was a little bit of casting about for, maybe I tried to get in Thomas Dolby's band, and I tried to do a number of things to try to keep the career going, and nothing was happening. And I didn't realize, because I didn't have perspective yet. And I feel like it took me a long time to develop it on what I am, who I am, how peculiar I am in some ways. I'm not, I'm not an eminently hireable rock and roll guitar player for any conceivable concept. I'm not. AC/DC isn't going to call me up. And I couldn't see myself from outside myself yet. I was too much in me. So I just didn't have a concept yet of how really off the beaten path I am as a musician and a creator or whatever. So but at some point I realized I better just start making albums. I better start making solo albums. That's my only hope, I think, of planting a flag here. And it also felt like the only way to honor Frank, especially once it became clear that he was ill and he was not going to be doing anything anymore. But at the same time that I was working on solo albums, I was still so addicted, I guess, to the Zappa way of doing things that when Dweezil asked me to join the band that he had with his brother Ahmet, which originally was called the Dweezil Zappa Band, and then it became Z or Zed. We that felt like a lifeline to me, a way to stay in the Zappa world, which was something that was really important to me. And also that band was unbelievably good. And it's the live shows that we did. Originally it was Dweezil, Ahmet, myself, Scott Tunis, and Josh Freese. Josh now is in the Foo Fighters and has played with everybody.
He was very young back then.
Yeah,
right?
he was extremely young.
18, 19 perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think Ahmet was 17, so they were the kids, and I was already, let's see, at this point in 1990, I was in my late 20s already, 91. I was in Dweezil's band until 96. So I did something like 5 years with that. So that was, I think I was trying to have it both ways. I was very happy to be in that band, and I loved that band. And I thought the stuff that Dweezil was writing was fantastic, and he was inspiring as a guitar player. And that really, that same kind of, I'll call it bratty energy that I appreciated from Devin at the time, as a sort of fuck you thing. That was definitely coming off of Ahmet at the time, and Dweezil as well. Dweezil was very interested in tweaking the conventions of rock and roll. So we had
his dad,
his dad. It came from that, but it was sort of like, you take that sort of really subversive energy of Frank and combine it with, Eddie Van Halen influenced guitar playing, incredible virtuosic rock and roll guitar playing that Dweezil has always done. Although now it's been exploded outwards with the expansion of his playing techniques and the way he's mastered Frank's melodies and all that. That's crazy. It really appealed to me the anti-entertainment, and it's like the sort of an Andy Kaufman energy translated into a rock band.
So you make the audience question.
You make the audience question. You make the audience uncomfortable, but at the same time, by the end of the show, hopefully we've all achieved some form of a satori together. We used to do this medley, a classic rock medley that at its peak had 200 snippets of songs in it.
I remember Staying Alive and all was in there, right?
Yeah. And the idea was that we wanted to just like very quickly touch off people's, memory bank. And then the moment they made the association, or possibly just before they had the opportunity, we've already moved on to the next song.
You played at the Dynamo Festival in Eindhoven, and you played, and that medley was there. And I don't know what to do with it, but it's great.
Exactly. And then Ahmet's, his energy as a performer, as a frontman, was, I've said for a long time, and I like Jack Black's comedy. I like his performances, but I think that Jack Black must have been to an Ahmet Zappa performance, because a lot of what became Jack's thing, I was seeing in Ahmet at the time. And again, it's just it's subversive,
And it was great because he had the capacity. It's Jack Black also. It's good because he pulls it off, right? Yeah, exactly. It's not like he's mediocre or something.
Because we only rehearsed. Our life was spent rehearsing that stuff. You don't learn a half-hour medley of songs where you're only playing each song for about a second and a half without doing a lot of rehearsal.
Yeah.
So that band didn't tour very much, and when we weren't touring, we were rehearsing. We lived to do that stuff, so we were deadly on stage.
Hey, but that kind of feeling, anti-establishment, perhaps. Did you have that as a kid prior to your professional career starting already, or like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always associated or identified with and sympathized with the underdog. It's like I remember my dad's disappointment when I was 11 years old or 10 years old in 1972 when the presidential race was Nixon and McGovern. And I think because I grew up loving the Beatles and when stuff like Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour was happening, I that felt like home to me, that sort of psychedelic place.
Yeah.
That was always more interesting, and I felt more connected to the universe in some way than the very conservative or the sort of polarization that we're seeing now. I will always identify more with the hippie.
That's a nice quote.
Yeah.
but because you mentioned your father, like did you have to struggle to get out of some sort of environment then?
Well, no, I did. I mean, I think he was tolerant of the fact that in my complete youthful naivete that I was like, no Nixon, I want McGovern to be the president. And it wasn't based on any, sort of intelligent analysis of policies or anything. It was just a feeling. And he just thought that I was a little goofball for feeling that way. But at the same time, I was, immensely supported by my parents. Once they saw that I had any kind of musical ability, they did nothing but support it, and my brother Marty as well, my older brother, all supported me and all believed in me, and I was given whatever gear that I needed, and given the time to establish myself musically in some way. When I was getting towards the end of 12th grade in high school, and I hadn't given a moment's thought to getting a proper job or going to university or anything like that. But I could see the end of my school days looming, and I said to my dad, well, I guess I gotta get a job or figure out college or something. And he said, your job is to write songs. Cause
Wow.
I'd already been writing songs at that point, and he like gestured over toward the Fender Rhodes and said, there's your job.
I get goosebumps, man. If you say, because that must have been very valuable to have that voice behind you from your parents.
And I also don't think I understood or appreciated how unusual that was, how unconventional it was to have parents be that supportive.
Yeah.
And I had older siblings that couldn't believe that I was being supported that way, and some might say, I might even say that perhaps I was spoiled to some degree.
So how many siblings did you in the line?
I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, all older than me. So
Okay.
I was the youngest of 5. And, being afforded all of these privileges and all this support, that, they didn't necessarily have, especially my much older brother and sisters, I definitely had it, easier.
They must have, your parents must have felt something very strong then, obviously also. Like
They saw something in me before, well before I did, because I didn't see myself as becoming a musician. But then for my 7th birthday, they got me this little electric organ.
Yeah.
And they were right, because the moment I looked at it, it's like I saw the music pouring out of it, and I was able to. It just said, "Of course, I see the melody right there. It's a keyboard. It's like it goes up, that you go there. It goes down, and you go there." It just, to me, a keyboard is like the perfect linear representation of music, and I was able to get into it right away. So they understood that about me well before I did, and at a very early age. And so, I was like pretty inseparable from the keyboard from age 7.
I heard you say you mentioned the Beatles. I heard you say the word obsessed. A lot of these players in the show call word obsessed. They say I was obsessed with either the guitar or the instrument or some kind of band. But how did that obsession look like back then? Like was it like literally the whole day you're listening to it or
kind of, yeah. It looked paisley.
Yeah.
I was definitely, even, when I would go back and listen to earlier Beatle records, the very earliest stuff, or the transitional stuff like Rubber Soul, I saw it all as part of this. I saw it all as part of this, kind of magical continuum. It felt like magic. still does in a way. I think that the Beatles were a magical phenomenon. It's kind of bizarre that it worked as well as it did. That the combination of those four energies created this world-changing, literally, world-changing force. It's crazy, and the music is just beautiful. And I think I was annoying about how much I loved it, and I remember my sister, Bobby, just like, she like had some kind of analogy for it. She said something like, do you ever hear the story of a little boy who could think of nothing but the Beatles, and it's like, and how annoying that was to everybody else. It was and it was because of her that I inherited my love of the Beatles, because she was she was a teenager in the 60s when Beatlemania was at its peak, and she had all these posters in her room. She had all the early records. But once it started getting into like Revolver era, and then especially Sgt. Pepper era, she was like,
I'm out of there.
Hell with this, and she gave all of her Beatles stuff to me. They had just moved past her at that point. So, she had already seen that I was into it, and she, and in a very fortuitous, decision for me, gave me all her Beatles stuff. So automatically I had this collection. I put all the posters that used to be in her room. I put them up in my room, which was also my brother Marty's room, because he was 3 years older than me, still is, and so he was very tolerant of my obsession, but it was an obsession. There were the days where I could think of nothing but the Beatles.
Was it through the Beatles that you discovered Frank Zappa? Because he was Ringo was in the was 200 Motels, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
Did you discover it like that, or okay?
It was through a poster at there was a record shop, and once we moved to San Diego in 1970, because I was born in Long Island, so throughout the 60s we were in Long Island, and then in mid 70. We moved to California, and there was a record store called Soundsville, which was the first sort of like hippie record shop that I would spend a bunch of time in. And I was fascinated by all of it. The graphic world of rock and roll at that time, the album covers. I mean, I was fascinated by the music, but I was also fascinated by the visuals. And they had posters, and there was a Frank Zappa poster of Frank on the toilet, not the most widely known image of Frank on the toilet. It was a different angle. And he looked especially, sinister in this photo, and it scared me. The picture scared me. I think I was scared by the brazenness of having your photograph taken on the toilet, and also the specific look on his face. So my first, overriding impression of Frank Zappa was a scary guy. And then my second impression of him was on the Dick Cavett show, which was a chat show in the U.S., thought to be a little more sophisticated, a little more erudite than some of the other talk shows. And the Mothers of Invention were a guest on that show. And I had, from looking at this poster, I had, formed an image in my head of how horrifying and ugly the music must be, just strictly from the way he looked. And then it was the Flo and Eddie band, and they played the song Sofa, which is a waltz, and it's a very, you can hear the performance on YouTube. I haven't seen the video, but you can, the audio is on there. And it's a pretty ragged sounding performance, but that at the time I was just struck by how beautiful the melody was, and that these were serious musicians, and they were executing the music perfectly. And there were these elaborate keyboard passages, and I had already been playing keyboard organ for a couple of years, and there's Ian Underwood playing these beautiful two-handed voicings up and down the keys, and Flo and Eddie singing this incredible melody in harmony. And I thought, wow, this is beautiful music. I wasn't expecting beautiful music out of these players. And then the kid across the street. Oh, and actually that there was a Beatle connection, because Frank was on the show to promote 200 Motels. So they showed a clip of Ringo, the clip that they chose from the movie to promote it was of just a monologue of Ringo. dressed up like Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
So yes, that did have an impact, but it wasn't like I was seeking out Frank because of the Beatles, but I was definitely like impacted by the fact that there was a connection.
But it's interesting. You mentioned words like beautiful and scared and that like all these contradictions that Zappa seemed to have had, like right?
Yeah.
Intriguing, of course, as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's the Thelonious Monk concept of ugly beauty, right? Ugly beauty does exist.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more beautiful when it springs out unexpectedly from a bed of ugliness.
Yeah, exactly.
But the thing that really did it was when this kid across the street named Eric McGrew, who it was always a startling and thrilling thing when an older kid would pay attention. It's like, and I was always a little bit. I was this weird combination of overconfident because I didn't realize how weird I was, but I also had a bit of social anxiety and didn't always fit in very well in situations. It could be difficult for me to relate. So when the older, cooler kid, the long-haired kid, there was no long hair in our house, and the long-haired kid across the street said, "Hey, I have a song you need to," he literally said, "You're weird. You need to hear this song." And I went into his living room. I can still, it's how certain flashes of moments really stick. I remember standing in his living room. I remember what the furniture looked like. It was the only time I'd ever been in there. And he played "Help I'm a Rock" from Freak Out. And he was right. So he somehow understood that this was going to be my music, and it was. And then I said, "I need this album." And he said, "Okay, I'll trade you." So he ended up getting a couple of albums from my collection, and he gave me Freak Out.
What did you give him?
I wish I could remember.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember. But it was evidently stuff I didn't need anymore.
Yeah.
So I even jettisoned the memory. But then I had Freak Out in my hands, and the early mono pressing of Freak Out, which I still have, and I listen to it all the time.
Listened, and also
I don't still listen to it all the time. That particular copy, because I played the hell out of it. It's pretty messed up now, but I still own it. But at the time, I listened to it constantly, and that second record that had "Help I'm a Rock" and "Monster Magnet" on it, were that disc was a key thing in my life.
That must have broadened your horizon of what music could be, right?
Yeah, I didn't have any. I didn't have any other albums like it. That's for sure. Nothing even remotely that experimental, with the possible exception of like Sgt. Pepper, or the White Album. Talk about a scary album. Jeez, the White Album is terrifying, and that was inspiring too, because it's okay. Here's the single most prominent popular entertainment phenomenon, the Beatles, doing something that crazy, that subversive. I say, okay, they knew that millions of people were going to take this album into their homes. Okay, well, John Lennon insists on putting Revolution 9 on this album. That's bold.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I went to the place where they went to Rishikesh in India when they wrote it. I went to that place and sat there and listened to the whole thing and completely felt.
You went to Rishikesh?
Yeah. I lived in India I worked there for a couple of years.
Okay.
So, and then I listened to the album on that spot, and I was like trying to feel all the. Yeah, I don't know, the weirdness and the energy, but also like the feeling that so many people listen to this, and it's such a strange combination of something that reached so many people and still so creative.
Yeah, and obviously it's a polarizing piece of art. But I've seen people say that it's the single most wide ranging in its influence, the single most powerful impacting piece of avant-garde art ever, and I think it's kind of hard to argue.
And it went number one.
Yeah.
Insane. Hey, my mind's going back and forth because there's so many things I'd like to discuss with you. One of the things, because obviously there's Frank the composer and also Frank the guitar player, right? in that bio I mentioned before, you also wrote that you, at one point in your career when you're soloing, saw triangles,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
And which remind me of Frank Zappa when he was soloing. He was it a spaceship or something he saw? He saw forms as well. Like,
okay.
You didn't know that?
No,
okay.
Yeah.
But what happened? Can you tell me when you improvised back, because you don't have that anymore?
Mm-hmm.
You wrote, right? But
yeah.
But what?
No, it was. They were like like a bowling pin formation. It's 10 brown triangles that would appear up, and it felt like they were. It's very arcane and weird, but it felt like it was like delivering musical notation in a completely otherworldly system.
Mm.
You know, it's like, and I didn't have to read it. It was like it was telling me what to play, and this went on for a few months, and then it stopped.
Mm.
And I was listening to a lot of John Coltrane at the time, and I was very inspired by his improvisational explorations, and I felt like I wasn't able to get anywhere near that until these triangles appeared.
Wow.
And then once it seemed to me like I had been nurtured a bit by it, and that my musical development had undergone some evolution. It was like they felt their job was done, and then they went away.
Yeah. So, but you,
and I don't say this in order to claim that my improvisation is in any way comparable to Coltrane's, but just that he provided an example of something I was reaching for. But also, I'd never had the discipline to like just run scales for 9 hours at a time the way he would. He put in the time. I got a shortcut from some brown triangles.
and
the results are not as transcendent as Coltrane's, but for me and where I was at musically at the time, it represented an evolution.
You mentioned the word discipline. What role did discipline play in your musicianship? Like you said, I never went 9 hours running scales, but of course you must have had some focus, right, and the determination.
Yeah, when I was much younger, and I felt like I'm going to put in the time here and see how I can work with this thing, because it did seem as though I had a natural affinity for playing, you know, what would normally be referred to as a gift. And what I didn't appreciate at the time is that no one can claim a responsibility or ownership for a gift that they have received. All you can do is use it well. So, you know, when I was much younger, I was much more prideful about what I considered to be my abilities. As time went on, I began to shed the pride aspect and try to take on more of the gratitude aspect and the humility aspect, because that's what I think is really happening. I've been given this from wherever such things come, and it's my job to tend it and use it well. Mm-hmm. And that does require discipline, and that's traditionally not been my strong suit. But when I have gigs that I have to do, you know, like for the last month, all I've been doing is the Moth. You know, it's this long, very dense, you know, it's 70 minutes of music where nothing repeats. So it's a tremendous amount of memorization, because my part was sort of created by myself and Devin in tandem. You know, Devin demoed a bunch of stuff. He sent me the demo tracks, and then I sort of crafted my part out of what I was hearing there. In some cases, very, you know, specific to what I was hearing in his demos, and in some cases, just sort of my extrapolation thereof. I don't any longer have the same type of time that I had when I was 16 and decided to spend an entire summer learning all of the Gentle Giant guitar parts.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That was a that was a choice I made, and I made it at the expense of anything resembling a social life. You know, like most kids my age were going out and dating and stuff, and I was at home with the Gentle Giant records, just keep putting the needle back on the vinyl. I didn't even like record it onto tape for easier manipulation.
But those are very valuable years, I guess, right? When you're young, 16, 17, and you make this your learning curve is very steep, I suppose, right?
Yeah, it is. And I was a sponge for all of it, and I loved it so much. So that's where I think I was relatively undisciplined, because of a truly well-rounded musician. I think of somebody like Scott Tunis, for example, who was at the show last night. He came with his buddy Marty Schwartz, who's a fantastic guitar player. They traveled from the U.S. to see the show and to support Devin. It's beautiful. But one of my most crazy memories of when I first got into the Zappa band was Frank pushing a button on the synclavier and playing a sequence of the piece Mo and Herb's Vacation. It was very elaborate, one of his very elaborate instrumental compositions for orchestra. So, but this was a synclavier arrangement of it that exists on a floppy disk somewhere and should be released. That's my buddy Joe Travers' job. Find that.
Yes.
And as soon as Frank hit the button and it started to play, Scott ran to get a chart. He knew where the bass chart for, and it might have even been like not even for a bass guitar, but for an orchestral, low register instrument. And he ran and got the chart and he played along with it. And I don't even know if he'd ever played it before, but he was reading it down, this lengthy, incredibly elaborate composition. And I remember thinking, that's a superhuman skill, because I had never, last night I'm standing in front of this orchestra that are full of superhumans as far as I'm concerned, because they're all just reading this stuff down. I don't have that skill. I always just gravitated towards stuff I loved, stuff that engaged me, and never put myself through the mill of the hardcore stuff. This is how you orchestrate. This is what this, arcane dynamic, phraseology means. I can't.
What happens if you go there? Like it fights you off, or
yeah, I feel like I feel like I'm being physically assaulted.
Oh wow.
and that, which doesn't mean that I don't occasionally have to go there, especially if I'm like working with a new musician on one of my own compositions, maybe something I've already put on a record. And typically if I have a really complex composition on one of my own records that I need somebody else to play, I'll demo out the part, as opposed to writing it down. But occasionally somebody will go, no, fuck you, I'm not going to play this unless you make me a chart. And so I have to sit down and write the stuff out, and it's just
being physically assaulted.
It's tremendously painful. Yeah.
So how, because I'm also intrigued about, because you as a solo artist, it's a different way of working, I suppose, because Devin obviously had a goal, right? We have to perform at that moment and we have to reach the goal by then. How do you find that dynamic within yourself when you're creating yourself, and there's nobody basically there to say, okay, it has to be finished by then?
Yeah. Well, what that has resulted in, especially over the last few years since lockdown, because I spent a lot of time, where the only other person I saw for a year and a half was Sarah, and I wasn't interacting with other musicians, and so I just started creating music at home, and ended up with piles and piles of what has turned out to be unfinished stuff. When there's not a deadline or a specific finished product that I'm working toward, and I'm just creating, what I found is that I end up just like accruing a lot of unfinished stuff. So my challenge now is to finish some of it. And I did a couple of years ago. I put out an album called "The Thing That Knowledge Can't Eat," which was, finally me forming 40 minutes of music out of this body of unfinished things. And I was happy with that album, but I have a lot more of it. And I also have higher ambitions for the next iteration, the next album I put out. And also, I feel somehow that I have to do something to meet the challenge of this point in history without being tiresome or hectoring about it. And Sarah is very insistent on me not wallowing, is like, isn't life really messed up right now? And he hears how it's impacting me negatively. Ultimately, I don't really think do anybody any good to live in that echo chamber. And that I think is evident from, just looking at the misery that gets perpetuated through comments sections online where, and I think living in that place is not going to be helpful for people. And I have a lot of lyrics to write. I put together a playlist of what I think of as the best of the stuff that I have in the works right now, and 9 of the songs need lyrics, and I think that it's not an accident that those songs need lyrics, and and those lyrics haven't come to me, and now I can start to feel that building, and that I don't know exactly how it's going to shake out, what the final form is going to be, but I do think that there's going to be a lot of words coming out of me this year, and that I feel myself steeling myself, readying myself to do that, and hopefully the end result will be something helpful.
I'm curious to find out, because before we wrap this up, because we're talking now about your solo albums, I like to talk about your first few solo albums, and then also I also always forget his name. I have to look it up. Marcello Radulovich with.
Oh yeah.
Okay. First, I want to go to your headspace when you created Hat, and boy,
okay,
spec. What was your idea?
Well, that was a point where I was very disciplined, because I this was 1992. I guess I started working on the album in 91, but I had friends in San Diego, Jeff and Suzanne Forrest, who had started this record label called Immune Records, and they offered me the opportunity to make an album for that label, and I thought, okay, this is how I'm going to. This is how I'm going to channel the inspiration that I feel from the experience I've just gone through with Frank. Because I spent a couple of years really just sort of like flailing around trying to see if there was a way to leverage my association with Frank into some kind of a professional musical career, and that fell flat. That didn't work because I didn't understand how best to package what I could offer somebody else's music. So there was no demand for me. So the best thing I could do was to just start focusing on my own stuff. And it was actually while I was beginning the work on Hat that I eventually started to fall in with Dweezil and his band. So that took care of the professional musical obligation, because I had a gig. I was in Dweezil's band. And so that I felt like that freed me up to just, when I wasn't doing that, what am I doing on my record?
Does that work for you to have your gig as a sideman, and you need that kind of balance, right? You have your own thing, your thing as a sideman, which might take the pressure off of your own thing, right?
Well, it relieves pressure in one way and it adds pressure in another way.
Yeah.
It takes time. It takes time away from but it allows you to survive.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't look a gift horse in the mouth. I'm extremely grateful for every gig that I get, because I think that my, what's the Spinal Tap phrase? I think that my appeal is selective. Meaning I'm not necessarily going to slot comfortably into any context. So anytime somebody like Devin or Joe Satriani or Steve Vai or Death Clock or any of the other artists that I've worked with have decided that what I do can bring something to what they do, and that provides me with financial support that I need to
money
to live.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for that. Mm-hmm. And no one is entitled to a successful career. And there are a lot of really, really gifted, really, really talented people who don't achieve even my limited visibility. So I'm grateful for every moment of it. But yeah, it does take time away from working on your own stuff. But I was so driven at the time of creating the music for Hat. That's the one album where the whole album was essentially blueprinted. It wasn't charted out necessarily, but I had the concept of the whole thing from start to finish, well before I went into the recording studio. I knew all these weird little segues. I knew all the, cause that's a very eccentric album. There's all these strange little phrases and interruptions and crazy things. And that was all figured out beforehand.
I wrote to you. I had it illegally copy on tape, and I always felt guilty listening to it because it started with "Thank you for buying Hat." I was like, "Oh, I didn't buy it. Sorry
Thank you for stealing Hat."
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. I'm glad.
I bought a couple of your albums later on. So.
There you go. There you go. You atoned for that sin. But no worries. But I knew that I wanted the album to start that way. I thought that would be a striking way to begin a record. Here's a left field one. That was probably inspired by, more than anything else, an album called Gilbert O'Sullivan himself, who he's the guy who did a song called Alone Again Naturally. This and kind of middle of the road balladeer, but eccentric also. And his album began and ended with these little direct messages to the audience, just him on piano. He's going, "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present myself to you." And then at the end of the album, he goes, "I'd like to thank you." So it's just felt like, oh, how nice. It's a direct message from the recording studio to me. It formed a connection. So I felt like I wanted to do the same thing with Hat. But then from that point on, it's just this roller coaster ride with hairpin turns all over the place, crazy edits, and all of that stuff is obviously enthralled to Frank. The editing techniques that he developed on, like We're Only In It for the Money and Lumpy Gravy and Uncle Meat, very influential on my early records. And I think that they definitely come across as somebody enthralled to Zappa in that way. And then Boil That Dust Back was an extension of that editing concept, but by that time Frank had died. My father had died. My child was born. Life had changed a lot in the 2 years between Hat and Dustback. Yeah. And so, Dustback feels, much more affected by the world, whereas Hat is very
frivolous
It's frivolous,
right?
And it's idiosyncratic. And I remember, reading a review of Hat at the time that said that I was, fascinated by my own dreams. And I said that, that's true. There's a lot of dream imagery on that record. And I think that Dustback is a darker album that acknowledges, okay, there's a larger, weirder world outside of my dream world. So that's I look at Dustback as sort of like the darker flip side of Hat.
The beginning, what's the name of the first song? It's much heavier, right?
Cause of Breakfast.
Yeah.
Which that's a specific reference to my dad, who I dedicated that album to, who had passed away while I was working on the album. That was a phrase that when I was very young, like 4 or 5 years old, and I don't know why I said this, but somebody asked me, why do you feel this way? And my response to that was, because of breakfast. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what that means even. But my dad was so tickled by it that he adopted it as a catchphrase. And so whenever, somebody would ask him, why are you doing that? Because of breakfast. It seemed like as good a reason as any. So that song, which is about it's sort of, because both my father and Frank, died, from the same disease. And they were both sort of like they were both like towering male authority figures in my life. my dad was my real dad, and my dad Frank was, even though he hated being considered anybody's father figure other than his own kids, because I was so young and so admiring of him, so hungry for his approval, that he definitely occupied a kind of a father figure position in my life. So to lose both of them in pretty rapid succession from the same disease was traumatic, and then that album was the result.
Strange how we now years later talk because of Breakfast that music can bring that back. Right. I mean, yeah. It's because I can imagine,
and musically, I was very enthralled to Soundgarden at the time. So, in a really weird way, the music of that album and that song in particular, "Cause of Breakfast," which is very heavy riffs, but constantly shifting time signatures, very difficult. It's like one of the hardest songs in my repertoire. Any new musician who comes into my orbit who has to learn that song, they get to feel the pain. But yeah, I remember specifically thinking, oh, this is my attempt to write a Soundgarden song, except for the instrumental part in the middle is that became known in the band as the Vi section. I think Brian Bella referred to it, or maybe it was Joe Travers who referred to it as the Vi section because it reminded them some of the crazier stuff on Passion and Warfare.
Yeah. But it's also beautiful how your albums become these monuments in your life, right?
Everyone's it's truly a record, even though they're not. It's my stuff hasn't come out on vinyl, but they're still records because they're a record of the time in which they were made. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hey, before we wrap this up, I'd like to talk with that cooperation you have with Marcello Radulovich, if I pronounce that right, because you've been really productive, right?
I've known him since the mid '80s when I had a band in San Diego called with my brother called Drop Control, and Marcello had a band called Playground Slap, and we were both on the same burgeoning original music scene in San Diego, which for anybody doing unusual original music, it was people tended to kind of cling together because there's a bar music scene where you're expected to just go and play the top 40 and songs that people can dance to. And Marcello's music is very danceable, but it was also very eccentric, and he was very creative, and I thought that he married this almost a rhythmic sensibility that reminded me a lot of Prince, but to all this very unusual experimental textures and techniques, and I love the combination. And then as a performer and as a vocalist, he had a really strong presence, and I was just really enamored of everything that he did. And so now here we are 40 years later. And a couple of years ago, he proposed that we start, collaborating, because we had maintained a friendship and a connection through the years, but we hadn't been making any music. But he just said, hey, send me some stuff, record some things from your home studio and send them to me. Just improvise and I'll see what I can make out of them. So I sent him a piano sketch and about 9 minutes of improvised guitar. And then he went to town and turned them into completed pieces of music. And I went, whoa, this is promising.
Yeah.
And then he proposed, well, let's do a series of albums. We'll do 2 concurrent album series. One will be instrumental, vaguely referred to as ambient, but really they're just instrumental, what they turn out, however they turn out. And then at the same time, we'll do a separate series of albums that are vocal tunes. And so the instrumental albums are all named after the days of the week. And we've gotten as far as Thursday at this point, Monday through Thursday. And then we're doing a series of what will probably end up being 3 vocal albums, which the umbrella title for that is Basque, B-A-S-K. So we've done Basque and Basque 2, and those are those are songs with lyrics and vocal melodies. And then the Days of the Week albums are instrumental. And in a year and a half, we've turned out 4 Days of the Week albums and 2 Basque albums. So 6 albums in 18 months while, we've both been involved in doing any number of other things at the same time. And sometimes I'll record stuff at home and send it to him, but then other times because I live in northern Arizona now. Sometimes when I get into San Diego where he lives, I'll go and set up camp at his place for a couple of days, and we'll record stuff together. Yeah. And it's just so rewarding because I love the idea. I can get as involved as I have the time and energy to do. And then sometimes it's just I'll do an improvised fretless bass track and he'll make an amazing piece of music out of it. And it's been an incredible delight for me to see how he accepts the stuff that I give and turns it into in every case, stuff that I just find fascinating. It's amazing headphone listening. I love listening to the stuff that he creates out of the stuff that I get.
Yeah, it's beautiful music. I listened to it on Spotify, and when I checked it, I was like, there's not that many people listening to it. You can see the numbers. I was like, huh? Yeah. Which in a way also felt good because there's just a few people listening to this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I'm very familiar with that phenomenon. I felt the same way when I was growing up. I liked the idea of feeling like I belonged to an exclusive club.
Yeah.
However, I would encourage people.
Yes,
please join the club.
No, because it's really it's beautiful. But again, this is said. You just have to make this right, regardless. Of course, it's great if people listen to it.
Right, exactly, exactly. And I think that the rise of Bandcamp as a platform for musicians has really allowed us a way to move forward.
I'll switch.
Because I think Bandcamp has kind of become the de facto platform for music lovers who want to actively support the artists that they enjoy.
Yeah.
As opposed to the increasingly prevalent attitude that music should be free. There is the community of people on Bandcamp who still can appreciate the idea that the people who make this music need to live somehow. And Bandcamp is a way for people to support artists, as is Patreon, which has become an invaluable thing in my life. I started a Patreon account 3 or so months into lockdown, and to the extent that my schedule allows it, I try to keep that updated, all the time to the present day. And we have a cozy community at this point of about 180 subscribers, which is lovely. And I try to keep them fed with unreleased music and weird things from my archives and periodic live chats and the video chats where we can talk about whatever, or I can share new stuff that I'm working on or whatever. And so between Patreon and Bandcamp, there are places where people can support artists that feel like a slight way of stemming this tide of it being really difficult to monetize music creation nowadays, because nobody thinks that they should pay for music anymore.
So anybody who's listening or watching, go there.
Yeah, please.
Hey, Mike Keneally, first of all, thanks for all the amazing music you've made.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed listening to it. I mean, I can't imagine life without it.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
And thanks for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And listeners also, thanks for listening.
Yeah, and I thank them as well.